Hello and welcome to this video guide to The Woman in Black, focusing on Chapter 11, A Packet of Letters. So this chapter picks off directly where the previous one leaves us, where Arthur has passed out, but Arthur now comes around to discover he's been rescued by Mr. Daly. It's also the chapter where we get the exposition, the unraveling of the backstory, and we see here that this is a true ghost story in that its focus is not just the scares and the bumps and the thrill of the horror, but it is the uncovering of the mystery of the existence of the ghost. It's finding out the backstory of Jeanette Humphrey, the woman in black. So it begins with Arthur waking up from his fate, having been rescued by Mr. Samuel Daly, and he goes around the house feeling now much braver because there's a dog and it's daytime and there's another person with him. And as we know, ghosts don't appear if you've got a dog, as has been proven in the previous chapter. And they certainly don't appear in daylight, as was proven in chapter 4. Anyway, despite the unwiseness of his decisions, Arthur goes back upstairs and goes back to the nursery. He can't resist the drawer of the nursery even now. And he finds out the door isn't locked, and then the room looks nothing like it did before. It's been absolutely devastated, pulled apart. And in the middle of the devastation sits the rocking chair, presumably the chair that had at one point in time been occupied by the woman in black, Jeanette Humphrey, at some stage. Arthur briefly, very briefly, tries to rationalize these events. He can't stop it. The rational protagonist in him is still there in some shred. And to an extent we can understand, because he needs there to be an explanation, a normal explanation. Someone's broken in and vandalized the room. Because at least then he goes, oh, well, he can say to himself that, that there is a reason and a logic and something that he can understand behind it. But of course, the door, the windows are barred, the door only locks from the inside, and there can only be one explanation, and that is that there is a malevolent supernatural presence at work. And this is one of the things that completely unseats Arthur's equilibrium and sends him into the nervous distress that we know he suffers from for many years to come. He leaves, and this time his description on the way out of Eelmarsh House is very, very different. He returns to Crith and Gifford, but rather than the Gifford Arms, Mr. Daly insists that he stays with him because he realizes he can obviously see that Arthur is on the edge. Arthur takes up the offer, and during this time we actually get this exposition. Arthur reads the remainder of the letters and uncovers the backstory, realizes what's going on, the story of Jeanette Humphrey having to give up her child, the subsequent adoption by her sister, and Mr. Daly fills in the backstories about how Jeanette Humphrey couldn't stay away and was planning on running away with the child on the night that the child died out on the moors. On the marshes. He also goes on to talk about the years subsequent to that and the death of Jeanette Humphrey, dying essentially of grief over a long period of time, and her return as the ghost, the woman in black, and the consequences of the woman in black being seen. As a result of hearing all of this, Arthur, I say fairly promptly, it takes him about 24 hours, has a nervous breakdown, literally collapses, ends up in a fever, and eventually he does recover after several days of delirium and nightmares, which he does go into some level of description about, talking about how he feels like the presence of the woman in black sitting on his bed or sitting over his shoulder and just being there and menacing him. And as he's recovering, Stella arrives, the long-lived Stella. We know she does not make it out the end of this story, so there's still a sting in the tail left. So, things to look at. This is the section of the story with exposition. Exposition is the telling of events, where someone goes, this is the stuff that happened, and we get a lot of this through here. And it's done through the traditional frame narrative, where we get this epistolary form, where we see the letters exposing some of it, and Mr. Daly fills in the gaps. we've got the sentence structure. When we see dialogue between them, there's a lot of pauses, there's a lot of moments of tension where someone is just waiting, hoping they don't have to say what they're going to say, or being too afraid to say things out loud. And this demonstrates the kind of reluctance that Mr. Daly still has to reveal the story, not perhaps because he's concerned about the impact on him, but he's more concerned about how Arthur will react. We've also got contrasts and inversions. The descriptions of several places get flipped on their head. The nursery, which was well ordered and almost comforting, becomes chaotic and ruinous. Arthur's description of Eelmarsh House, he's no longer attracted to the place. He recognizes it for what it is. And Arthur himself is completely different. He's no longer the arrogant, rational protagonist who thinks he can take on everything. He realizes that his worldview has been upended. This, to an extent, contributes to his nervous breakdown. And he is on his way. He hasn't finished this journey. On his way to being the broken man to whom he refers in chapter 1. And visual imagery replaces sound imagery to an extent. When we see the description of the nursery, it really does focus on what can be seen. And very, very powerful stuff. So this is an interesting quotation where we get lots and lots of kind of reflection on what it is that's really upset Arthur. He talks about the sense, the distress, the oppressive hatred and malevolence, the grief and distress. These are the things. It's the emotions that are forced onto him by the haunting. That is the thing that is most distressing to him. And again, we've got Hill kind of dealing with ideas that are very common tropes of the Gothic. Yeah, no, she says herself it's not a Gothic novel, it's a ghost story, but those two genres cross over, and she borrows heavily here, and she's touching on ideas of madness and unrestrained emotion. Yes, yeah, here we have that description of Arthur's reaction to Eelmarsh House. Yes, the wind would drop, etc., but it would be no less dreadful. It's taken him long enough to work this out. But what this does signal to us here is that the hold, the attraction, the strange pull that this place once had is no longer. Arthur sees it for what it really is, no matter that it is so late. I've pulled these two quotations here because they demonstrate what I was referring to earlier. This visual description, like entrails, strewn, smashed, there's some powerful language in here. It's clearly in disarray. The powerful visual imagery of the anger that the woman in black must have had to smash this room that had otherwise been perfectly preserved. And the use of the idea of like entrails from a wounded body is quite literally visceral, and the impact is quite literally visceral as well. And here we've got the symbolism of the rocking chair which symbolizes the woman in black's presence. You can imagine that was the chair in which she was sat the night she was waiting for her son to return. And then that was the chair she got out of when she could hear the noises and watched as her son slowly died before her very eyes. I mean, it's an incredibly powerful image that is painted during the exposition, during the backstory. This is interesting. Here we get also in this chapter an exploration of some of the contextual features. There is a social context commentary. I've even read some things where some people where a critic was examining this in terms of also the social context of women in the 1980s, which maybe wasn't as far forward as it should have been. Well, I say maybe, it definitely wasn't as far forward as it should have been. I mean, we don't have equality even now, but it's interesting that this is definitely a comment on the social conditions of the Victorian period and attitudes towards single motherhood. Attitudes which, in many parts of the country, probably weren't that different in the 1980s. And what is also interesting is that we've also got the idea that there's a different perspective on social expectations depending on the level that you are in society. What is quite interesting, and I find worthy of comment, is that Arthur says at least Jeanette had known that her son was alive and been given a good home. It's a fairly naive statement on Arthur's part, and it's an interesting one, and it kind of shows to an extent that disconnect that Arthur has from the experience of being a mother and the experience of being a parent, a disconnect which he connects with. Obviously, as we see, he is acting as a parent, but again, the role of a father or a stepfather or an adoptive father would be very different in that time frame compared to the role of a mother. And this is interesting. This is at the end of this key exposition. The intensity of her grief and distress, the pent up hatred and desire for revenge permeated the air all around. Arthur's uncovered the story, but if anything, he's worse off for this knowledge. And this is also reflective of Arthur's ability to look back and analyze now that he is out of the situation. Again, I make no apologies. There are a lot of quotations being pulled out of this section of the novel because there are a lot of quotations in this section of the novel. Let's just have a quick look at this one here. We've got an exchange. And again, this shows that backwards and forwards where we're sort of introduced to the consequences. That's an end of it. I saw that his face was troubled. And here we subsequently find out about what happens after the woman in black has been seen, and as we subsequently go on to find that there hasn't been the death of a child yet, although Mr. Daly is very keen to point out that sometimes it's very soon, sometimes it's a little bit afterwards, but there's always some consequence to the woman in black having been witnessed. And the final line of the chapter is also a stark reminder of Stella's character. Stella, my own dear Stella, was coming straight across the room towards me. There's a foreshadowing there that is profound, clear, but it still doesn't prepare us for what happens in the next chapter. Thank you very much for listening. I hope this was useful. Bye-bye now.